Hey game developers, Bilal from Zenfinity.net, and welcome back to the C# Fundamentals for Unity course. And in this one we're going to be talking about classes, which are arguably the biggest thing in object-oriented programming. But before we get into that, I want to say the previous episode is available for you to click in the top right. If you hit that I, there will be a link to it if you want to check out functions before you get into classes. And you can also check out the entire playlist for the C# Fundamentals for Unity course right now if you hit that I in the top right as well. So if you just want to pay attention to classes or you've watched the rest of them already, then go ahead and follow along with me in Visual Studio. If you don't have Visual Studio, that's fine. You can just go ahead and type in whatever text editor, but you'll need something to compile it. Okay, so why don't I start with explaining what a class is, right? So, I mean, you can see this keyword class here on my screen. But if we want to go for a more abstracted explanation of what it is, we can describe a class as a blueprint. Imagine a blueprint is, well, I guess it is a kind of paper that describes how to make something and what it's going to be composed of. And it's used as directions for the construction workers to build a building. So in our comparison here, we can say that a class is a blueprint and an object is a building, right? So, you use the blueprint to create the building, and you use the class to construct an object. So why don't we go ahead and start with actually just some example here of using a constructor, which is how you build a class. It's the function that builds a class into an object. And then we can move on from there, right? So I'm going to go ahead and delete this code out of our main function, but I'm leaving this one here. The only reason read key is important is because it will leave the console output open until I hit a key to close it. So make sure to leave that in there. Okay, so let's go ahead and make a random object, for example. So I'm going to type in there, which is just well, I'll show you in a second. Random object equals new random. Right. So random is just it's a class that's used for generating random numbers, but we're not actually going to use it now. I just want to show you this for example. And I believe this is from system, so make sure you have this using up here, using system. Otherwise, not 100% sure. It might just work without it. Anyway, so moving on. Now we have an object, right? So random object is a variable that has a pointer or a reference to this object that we just created of the class random, or of the type random, because classes are used as types of objects. All right, so now why did we do that, right? So what can we even do with this? I mean, we've been doing this for a while now, especially if you've been using Unity. We can say random object dot, right? And the dot is an accessor for all the members, another keyword for classes. A member is just anything that's inside of a class. So it's these attributes, which are variables, basically, that store objects. And then there are also functions, right? Like main is a function, my function is a function, which are actually called methods. So functions are methods when they're in a class. Variables are actually called attributes when they're in a class. And attributes and methods are both members of a class. Okay, so not crazy important for you to know those immediately, but it's nice to know that kind of terminology because it helps you keep the plan in your head. Because with object-oriented programming, you want to always be paying attention to the plan. Okay, so now, why don't we go ahead and look at these members that we can access, right? So we see next, like next bytes, next double, right? So these are just functions that are going to give us a random number, right? So why don't we go ahead and use the console here to print console right line, and we'll print a random double, I guess. And I believe this is going to be, yeah. So it's greater than or equal to 0 and less than 1. So we should see a random number when we start here. I'll go ahead and hit the start button up here. Okay, and we see 0.017, and a lot of numbers afterward. So there's our random number. I'll hit X, and we'll do that one more time because, you know, for the sake of it being a random thing. So we see 0.3. Okay, so the important thing to take away here is that we're accessing this method of this random object. So that's pretty much how you access, right? Stuff from a class. And if random had attributes like numbers, we could have it accessed in the same exact way with a dot. So since it doesn't, why don't we go ahead and make a class to actually show you how this kind of thing works, right? So what I'm going to do is go ahead and hit this minimize button on program. If you don't have that, it's just a visual feature, so I don't get annoyed by how much stuff is in the way. So let's go ahead and make another class, right? So I'll write public class, and since we make games, we don't do boring stuff like making person or cat or something like that. We'll do spaceship, right? So this is a class spaceship, and then you need the curly brackets at the end, and boom, we have a class, right? And now we just need to put stuff in it, right? So I mean, spaceships have what? I guess it has durability, right? So let's say public int hull integrity, right? And I'll set it equal to, I don't know, 5 by default, and then we'll have a public int. There's one more thing I was thinking. Let's say weapon damage, right? Weapon damage equals, I don't know, 10 because we got fat lasers on it. And now we have 2 attributes in our function, right? So, or in our class, right? So why don't we go ahead and use the default constructor here, right? So in a class, like I said before, the constructor, you can pretty much think of it as a construction worker. It builds the class, it builds the blueprints into a building or into an object, right? So every class has a default constructor unless it's static. So let's go ahead and in our main function write spaceship. I don't know, what's a cool spaceship name? Let's say it's Starship Enterprise, right? Starship Enterprise equals new spaceship. And we put these here because, again, a constructor is a function. This is the notation for calling a function. Okay, so, well, now we have a spaceship, but, you know, what do we do with this thing? Well, we can, since these are public, we can modify them, and we can change, we can also just print them, do whatever we want with them. We could apply the weapon damage to something else. So let's go ahead and see how Visual Studio, I guess, will recognize. We can write this dot, and then we see hull integrity, and we see weapon damage. Okay, so I can say, you know, hull integrity equals 2. Let's say, like, they got hit by something. So before I change it to 2, console.writeLine, I'll print it, and then I'll print it again after we change it to 2. And of course, this is, you know, tedious, mundane. Oh, let me go ahead and actually access the member here. Make sure that you always do this because, again, these are not just global variables. These are a part of a blueprint that can be turned into something, right? So every single spaceship is going to have a different hull integrity, or I guess they can be the same value, but they'll be a different object in your memory, which means that if I change hull integrity of the Starship Enterprise, then the hull integrity of the Millennium Falcon, for example, is not going to change, right? So why don't we go ahead and print this again, just for the sake of getting it to be clear here. I'll go ahead and hit start, and we see it's 5 and then it's 2, right? So we set it to 2 afterward because it changed. Yeah, simple and very clear, right? So now we have the ability to do this, but how do we make, how do we do this in a more interesting way, right? So why don't we go ahead and design our own constructor here that lets us, well, do something, or create this default spaceship without having to just make a new one and then change everything monotonously, right? So why don't we go ahead and write public spaceship, and now we have a constructor. But I want to add parameters to our function here. And in the last episode, we talked about that. So here's what our parameters will be, right? So hull integrity. And before we write hull integrity, I'll put an int and an int weapon damage. Boom. Okay, so now we want to do, we want to set our hull integrity inside of this spaceship class to hull integrity. And the reason we do this dot is because if we just wrote this, even Visual Studio knows this is ambiguous. There's no way of it to know. Well, actually, it's not ambiguous. What it will do is use this argument here, and then it will set it to itself, so that'll do nothing. Whereas if we write this, then that actually changes the object's hull integrity. That's what we're going to be doing here, so that we can set it to whatever we want when we build it, right? So int weapon damage, we basically do the same thing here. Oh. So I'll copy this, paste it again, and I'll type in weapon damage, hit tab to autocomplete, and boom. Okay, now why don't we go ahead and create, instead of doing this, because now that we overwrote the default constructor, it doesn't, you know, it's waiting for us to pass it some arguments here. So let's say the Starship Enterprise has something more realistic, like, I don't know, 200 hull integrity, and let's say it's got like 100 weapon damage. Okay, so yeah, let's go ahead and print both of these, right? So console.writeLine, and I pull up that dialog box there with control space. If there's more than one function that it could autocomplete to, it'll bring a menu. But if I type in write L, then I hit control space, it'll autocomplete it. Okay, so I'll do writeLine Starship Enterprise here. Oops, not what I wanted to do. Dot hull integrity, and then we'll also do let's say the weapon damage. Okay, I'll hit start, and we'll see 200, 100. Perfect, right? So, all right, you might think, well, why would I even want to do this? Seems pretty useless, right? And that's the interesting thing about programming, is that all these things are simple stuff we do, but then once you put them into something more complicated, it gets you know, a lot more interesting and a lot more useful. So, for example, if I had two spaceships in a combat scene, one of the spaceships is going to shoot the other guy, so then that spaceship needs to take damage from the other one. So let's say like the spaceship uses its weapon damage to change the other one's hull integrity, right? So why don't we go ahead and write a function for that? So I'll do a public void damage other ship function, and in here we're going to be using our weapon damage, and then we'll be also passing this to another spaceship, right? So I'll also write a function for taking damage, and then we'll say int damage, right? Okay, so now in int damage, we want to take our weapon damage. It's going to minus equal damage, or not our weapon damage, our hull integrity. And let's over here we want to say target dot take damage weapon damage, right? So now what this will do is when we call this on another spaceship, the other spaceship will call this on itself and change its damage. And I just want to make sure I wasn't going too fast there, but basically we're just damaging another ship by passing a weapon damage and then applying it to our target, which is what this take damage function is. And I know that when I was first starting out, it became kind of weird to visualize the fact that this is more than one thing, but it's one class. So I'm going to go ahead and start up here with creating another spaceship to make it more clear how these are different things, right? So let's go ahead and say, instead of a Starship Enterprise, since I already said Millennium Falcon, we'll do it again. And let's say this one's got like, I don't know, 150. Sorry if I'm getting my movie history wrong. I don't know if the Millennium Falcon is bigger than the Starship Enterprise or not. Anyway, I'll delete these, and then we'll say Millennium Falcon, he takes a shot at this other one, right? So dot damage other ship, Starship Enterprise. And you know what? Why don't we go ahead and take out this parameter here, because it kind of makes it annoying to type in, because we're going to use our weapon damage anyway up here, and then it'll know that it's the class's weapon damage. Okay, so our weapon damage is 50. I'll put a semicolon here. And the Starship Enterprise's hull integrity is 200. So once this is called, the Starship Enterprise will now have a hull integrity of 150. So to visualize that again, for some reason I keep deleting these. Write this again. Oops. Okay, so in the first one we're going to say Starship Enterprise dot hull integrity, and of course we're doing the same exact thing after we take damage, right? So let's go ahead and hit start. 200, 150. Perfect. So there's a Star Wars and Star Trek crossover where the Star Wars ship damaged the Starship Enterprise here for some reason. But the point is that we changed the values of different objects based off of a blueprint. Now, ultimately, you can say, well, I could have done this by just setting one value Starship Enterprise health and then Millennium Falcon health and then, damage and damage for both. Yeah, you can. So the point of a class is don't repeat yourself. So that's a concept that I talked about, I don't know, with more than one episode of this entire series, is don't repeat yourself, because one, it's a waste of time, and two, you do not want to have a lack of planning or disorganization in your project. It makes it absolutely impossible for you to complete a large project if you don't have organization and if you don't have planning. So that's the point of things like classes and functions and all the other stuff we've been talking about. So this is actually basically it for my explanation of what classes are, how to use them, and why they're useful. So yeah, I mean, this is pretty much it. Just make sure you remember class is a blueprint. Use a constructor, this is our constructor here, to build it into an object. Then the object has values that can be modified independently of the class. So, and I mean, to even visualize, like, you cannot change the attribute of a class, a non-static attribute, which I'll explain in a later episode. So if I wrote spaceship dot, see how it doesn't come up, hull integrity equals 5. Obviously, I can't just overwrite the Millennium Falcon and the Starship Enterprise's hull integrities because it's, actually, hull integrity there. So it'll say it's non-static. It needs an object reference for it because it's a non-static field method or property, which just means that it belongs to an object. It doesn't belong to the blueprint. So that's going to be it for this episode. And if it helped you out, make sure to hit the like button. Let me know in the comments if this was bad, if it was good, if it helped you out, or if you want to just call me names, it's fine too. And hit the subscribe button for the rest of these, and make sure again to check out the playlist if you want to see the rest of these videos. And finally, there's one more card that's an ebook on how to create your first game, like faster, and it's totally free. Just go ahead and click there. And actually, finally, for real this time, there's another one about it's a free sample video from one of my courses that actually is related because it's about spaceship controls. So that's for Unity specifically. So it'll be using C# and Unity. With that said, I will see you in the next episode, and have a great day.